When is this damn war going to finish? 29 years ago, I was saying the same things. Then I was just fed up with the bullets and the bombs and the death. And quite honestly, I thought my luck was running out too fast. And now it's 1945, and I was wondering just how many more little victories we needed before the Germans finally give up. It never seemed enough. Let me introduce myself anyway. Harry Kay, accountant in the Treasury Department of Swinton and Pendlebury Town Council, near Manchester, father to Jeff and Mary and husband to Annie. But more pertinently to the story, I was Private Harry Kay of the 8th Battalion Seaforth Highlanders in World War One. I served my country from 1915 all the way through to 1919. And in November 1918, the armistice happened. A wonderful time, the armistice. I was alive. We celebrated, we sang, we drank, we clapped, we cheered, we did everything to celebrate. And we also remembered our friends, our comrades who hadn't got this far. A wonderful time. And in February 1919, we were finally demobbed. And we were very unsure of ourselves all of a sudden. It was a wonderful time saying goodbye, knowing we were going home for the very last time. We weren't going to have to come back and fight again. But we were saying goodbye to friends, to comrades. We shared the most dreadful times. We shared the most wonderful, close friendships and comradeships. We'd seen horrific things, we'd done dreadful things, and now we were being split up and going our own separate ways. We were potentially not going to see each other ever again. Through all those 4 years, there were my friends, my section, my platoon. We liked the same things. We dressed the same way in the same uniform. We ate the same things. We had the same enemy. We lived in the same place. We lost the same friends. We were more than friends, we were comrades, and for those who've been in the forces knows what that really means. We were always there for each other when somebody died, when we had bad news from home, when it was too cold or too hot, when we didn't have enough water or enough food, or when it just got too much for us, which it often did. We were there for each other. Alone, being supported and never alone. But this was May 1945. Annie and I were now alone. Jeff, my son, was abroad. He was somewhere in France with the Royal Marines. And the campaign from D-Day seemed to be going so well, but we heard little from him. Mary had gone away to college, all the way to Derby, and we rarely heard from her. Still, the last couple of days have been long awaited, even though at the end it's been, in some ways, a bit of an anticlimax. And I've got a story of victories, of gladness, of relief, of celebration, of hope, wonderful hope of a new life for the future. But first, I think I need to paint a picture about the last 12 months since D-Day. Every one of those days has been an effort. The rationing's still in place. I've still got my ration book. Food is still an issue. And I still can't grow any in our yard. My car is still in the garage that takes up all the space in the yard. It's been on bricks 5 years now. No petrol at all. Oh, some fresh homegrown food would be good. It would make such a difference to having those horrible powdered eggs. Now, we can still go out and eat in a restaurant occasionally. Annie and I like going out when we can. It's nice to get dressed up in our best. Her in her furs and me in my best suit. It makes us feel good. It puts a bit of a sparkle in our eyes. But it's a poor thing to take her to one of the best restaurants in Manchester and find out that the best thing on the menu is minced beef and carrots. Still, a bit of music hall afterwards usually made up for the food. And at work in the council, all the shortages made the council work even more difficult. We were trying to rehouse the locals who'd been bombed out. And we were also trying to help rehouse the people from the centre of Manchester, which had been flattened even worse. But the bombing now had stopped. This did relieve the pressure on the civil defence and on the council's finances. Apart from the food rationing, clothes rationing was still in place. See, I'm still wearing the same cardigan, shirt and bow tie 2 years later, and it still doesn't fit me, and I still am missing some of the buttons. But I can finally announce that earlier this year, the clothes rationing was finally relaxed. And I can with heartfelt relief confirm that now, if you can find them, men's shirt tails are a full 2 inches longer, and men's trousers can again have turn-ups. And glory be, men's jackets can now have more than one pocket. A victory for men's fashion and tailoring. Annie still reminds me that ladies' stockings can't be found for love nor money. Gone even are the days when ladies used to paint a stocking seam down the back of their legs. The latest thing among young ladies is to actually dye their entire legs the colour of stockings. Heaven knows what Mary's doing over there in college. I'm not sure I actually want to know. Last winter was dreadful. It was very cold. The fogs were terrible, smoke and all sorts in the air. People with weak chests were ill. Many people were off work. Getting home at night was awful. The blackout was still going and we couldn't get batteries for our torches. Even using my bicycle wasn't an option, never mind the car. My walk home was no more than a mile and I'd been walking it for 20 years, but even so, I still got lost. People were quiet and depressed. We were quiet too. We missed Mary and Jeff being around. And above everything, the war took precedence. Everybody was desperate for news. Everybody read the papers. Everybody listened to the radio. We wanted news from Jeff, but it wasn't forthcoming. We had no idea where he was. All we knew, he wasn't dead, and that was only because we hadn't had one of those telegrams. Nearly every week we heard that somebody we knew, a friend, a relation, somebody at work had received a telegram like that. But it was most agonising not knowing. But in spite of the danger, the hunger, the cold, the depressions, the need for news about loved ones, the lack of anything good, we just carried on. After all, what else was there to do? We lived our lives as normally as we could. We went to work every day, we visited friends and relations, we cooked, we ate, and we occasionally went out for a drink or to eat or to the music hall. We cope with the poor food, we cope with the queuing, and we cope with having to make do and mend our clothes. We cope with having to walk everywhere. We coped with having to deal with the bombed buildings, the missing shops, the missing offices, the missing doctors' surgeries and the hospitals, and all the inconvenience. We coped with the holes in the road, with the power cuts and the water cuts. But life went on. It always does. Why should we even think about giving up? What we couldn't cope with was the lack of news from our loved ones. We transferred this need of news to the newspapers and the radio. We listened to it all the time. We read all the newspapers we could find. I might have bought us a car, but I didn't think television would actually catch on, so I decided we didn't need one. But somebody down the street had one, and occasionally Annie would go and watch it and have a natter. The newspapers weren't as long as they used to be either. Newspaper rationing, but we read every column of every page every day. And to be honest, since D-Day, the news about the war had been good on all fronts. Every little step, every little gain was tantalising. And we thought the war would be over at Christmas by 1944. But then there was the big German counterattack in the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge, and that sent everything back. It took the wind out of our sails. It contributed to the really bad feelings and the depression over last winter. But things were improving again and our hopes were rising again. Now, let's see if I can remember some of the highlights for you. February 1945, Ecuador, Paraguay and Peru declare war on Germany. I remember thinking, wow, Hitler's really going to be worried now. Anyway, fair enough to them, I suppose. March 1945, the Allies crossed the Rhine. We were crossing into Germany, Jeff 2 somewhere. And at the same time, from the east, the Soviet forces were approaching Berlin. April 1945, the Russians reached Berlin shortly before the US forces. Some newspapers were getting suspicious of the Russians. All we wanted to know if the fact was Germany was being beaten. The 25th of April 1945. Vera Lynn's wish came true. The lights did come on again. Not all over the world, and the boys haven't come home yet. Well, not yet anyway. But the air raids had finished, and the street lights came back on, and the blackout blinds came down. I went outside some nights just to look at the street light on the corner. Children played under them, and people just congregated under them and chatted, just because they could. The blackout curtains were another matter. They'd been up for 5 solid years, and they weren't exactly clean, and the flies and spiders hiding behind them. Yuck. And the blast tape on the glass didn't come off well at all. It took us ages to clean all that old glue off. 28th of April 1945. That horrible Mussolini was captured and executed. On a more serious note, we've been getting reports from Austria and from other places that the Soviet and American troops had come across enormous camps, concentration camps they call them, full of dead and badly treated Jews and other peoples from all over Europe. You read those reports and looked at the photos with a mixture of disbelief and a wonder if it's a propaganda thing. In fact, the government put it out that to begin with it wasn't real after the first reports. Then one day Annie and I went to the cinema again together. There was the feature film which we'd gone for. Can't remember what it was now. But there were cartoons first, and we all laughed at them and shouted at the screen, and it was a bit like a pantomime. Then the Pathé News came on, and there was some first footage of British troops liberating a camp called Belsen. Apart from an audible gasp that went up from everybody in the cinema went dead silent. Annie gripped my hand hard as we watched, and she reached into her handbag and got a handkerchief. Other people started blowing their noses, men and women. I saw heads in front of me just looking away from the screen. I could hear sobs. Some people left. They didn't want to look at the screen anymore. I remembered my time in the trenches. I remembered seeing the dead bodies, the piles of dead bodies that we had to deal with, and the people that we'd liberated and the people that had climbed out of trenches. I tried to compare the men I'd seen with the men and the women and the children being shown here. I tried to remember the heaps of dead bodies. I tried to compare those I'd seen on the film with what I'd seen. I thought I'd had a bad time of it. I was stunned. My mind couldn't grasp the enormity of it, what I was seeing. I was involved in the war, the fighting, army versus army, but not this. This was, I don't know what I couldn't understand it. Even now, I've got no word for it. The most incongruous thing about it was that bit of news was followed by more cartoons. The cinema remained silent the whole way through the showing. Some days later, there was another Pathé News clip of another camp being rescued by the American GIs. There was a short footnote to this, saying that the American soldiers had actually shot to death about 150 of the Germans guarding the camp. The entire cinema cheered. But other than that, all the way into May, the good news stories continued. The 1st of May, German troops surrender in Italy. And it was broadcast that Hitler was dead. He committed suicide in his bomb-proof shelter together with his mistress Eva Braun. We were cross that he wasn't going to have a trial. The newspapers were just as indignant that it had come out that he tested his poison pill on his favourite pet dog beforehand. Even this news was treated with some resignation and disbelief. People thought he might have doubles or that he was in hiding somewhere. The 2nd of May, German troops surrender Berlin. The 4th of May, German troops surrender the Netherlands, Denmark and northern Germany. But just how many of these news stories were we going to hear before the end of the war was actually going to be announced? We just carried on. We didn't know what else to do. We were just waiting for that one little bit of news that would mean the war was actually over and that we had won. We just had to wait a little bit longer. In reality, the council were already planning for life after the war and life as victors. We were planning everything from where the new houses were going to come from and where they were going to be built. Not only from those bombed victims, but also new homes for the returning soldiers. We were planning for new factories and new hospitals and for repairing the streets and for new public buildings and getting rid of the bomb shelters and the gun and spotlight emplacements, getting rid of everything to do with that war. We were also planning celebrations. As a council, we were obliged to provide flags and speeches and the rest. At home, there was a general feeling there were going to be celebrations, but what were we going to celebrate with and when? We looked at all our food rationing, and the occasional tin of corned beef was put away in a box. Half a packet of biscuits was wrapped up and put away, a packet of jelly mix, a jar of jam, a packet of sweets. This box was sacrosanct. I wasn't allowed to go near it. People with flags of any sort were identified and told to make them ready. Old bunting from church bazaars from before the war was looked at. Some ladies were busy sewing their own. Shops ran out of flags and bunting. Old trestle tables were being repaired. Planning was well in hand for a victory, which we couldn't actually claim yet, and then it happened. Monday the 7th of May was an ordinary working day, as ordinary as all the preceding 5 days had been. Each day we were wondering if it was actually going to end in a holiday, the victory holiday. I was at work when we heard of a BBC announcement at 3 p.m. saying the German High Command had broadcast that they were obliged to surrender. But there was no other comment about it. What did that mean? Had they surrendered or had they not? I got home and switched the radio on. We didn't want to miss anything, but there was now a lovely feeling of anticipation. Annie and I kept looking at each other and just smiling. And at 7:40 p.m. the BBC announced that at 3 p.m. tomorrow, Tuesday, there will be a broadcast by the Prime Minister on account of agreements between the three main powers. And it was announced that the King would also address the country tomorrow at 9 p.m. And it was also said it was agreed tomorrow but would be a holiday, and that Wednesday would also be a holiday. We had to think this through. So was the war over? They didn't actually say so. But it couldn't mean anything else, could it? Well, there was no sign of celebrations outside. And after the build-up over the past few weeks, it was something of an anticlimax. They hadn't actually told us the war was over. We were, however, woken up at midnight. At first we thought it was an air raid warning, but then we remembered from New Year's Day before the war. It was the sound of all the hooters and the sirens of every ship in Manchester Dock and all along the Manchester Ship Canal. They were all celebrating V-Day. Deep, mournful blasts echoed around everywhere, filling the sky with sound, high-pitched hooters, and everything in between. It was a wonderful, wonderful sound. And the next morning, buntings were already beginning to fly up and down the street. Annie got the special box of rations out and disappeared down the road to sort things out with the other women. I had to go into work for a few hours to help sort out what the council were doing. And I got myself a newspaper that morning. Here we go. May the 8th, Europe at peace. Unconditional surrender of German nation. The signing is today. The King cables thanks to Ike. This is the last battle. Goebbels is found poisoned. Many famous men being set free. Well, there we go. Annie and I sat down and read it from cover to cover. And after that there was indeed a street party. A couple of plank tables were put together, and we all sat down. A motley collection of party foods were eaten, and we drank a lot of tea. There was some singing, and I even got my violin out and played a bit, and the kids played around us. It was good, and I mean good in the best sense of the word. We weren't the hysterical party goers I've been reading about and heard about on the radio. None of us even drank any alcohol. For some reason, we didn't need to. Our hearts were full. We were glad. We were at peace. The feeling was indescribable. We put the radio on at 3 o'clock, and this is some of what Churchill said. Yesterday morning at 2:41 a.m. at headquarters, General Jodl, the representative of the German High Command, and Grand Admiral Dönitz, the designated head of German state, signed the Act of Unconditional Surrender of all German land, sea and air forces in Europe to the Allied Expeditionary Force and simultaneously to the Soviet High Command. Hostilities will end officially at 1 minute after midnight tonight, Tuesday the 8th of May, but in the interest of saving lives, the ceasefire began yesterday to be sounded all along the front and to our dear Channel Islands, which are also going to be freed today. The Germans are still in places resisting the Russian troops. But if they continue to do so after midnight, they will deprive themselves of the protection of the laws of war. Today, perhaps, we shall think mostly of ourselves, but tomorrow we shall pay particular tribute to our Russian comrades, those whose prowess in the field has been one of the grand contributors to the great victory. The German war is therefore at an end. We may allow ourselves a brief period of rejoicing, but let us not forget for a moment the toil and efforts that lie ahead. Japan, with all her treachery and greed, remains unsubdued. The injury she has inflicted on Great Britain, the United States and other countries, and her detestable cruelties call for justice and retribution. We must now devote all our strength and resources to the completion of our task, both at home and abroad. Advance, Britannia! Long live the cause of freedom! God save the King! And we toasted him with cups of tea. And at 9 o'clock that evening we listened to the King, and several neighbours crowded in too to listen. This is some of what he said. Today we give thanks to Almighty God for a great deliverance. Speaking from our empire's oldest capital, war-battened but never for one moment daunted or dismayed, speaking from London, I ask to join with me in that act of thanksgiving. Germany, the enemy who drove all Europe into war, has finally been overcome. Let us all, those who will not come back, their constancy and courage in battle and sacrifice and endurance in the face of a merciless enemy. Let us remember the men in all the services and the women in all our services who have laid down their lives. We have come to the end of our tribulation, and they are not with us at this moment of our rejoicing. And he went on and on and on. Let's find the end of the newspaper. The next day was a holiday too. More bread and dripping for breakfast. Still, I'm sure things are going to get better. We decided not to go into Manchester to join in those celebrations. We spent the last few years rather sad that we were alone, and now, talking about it over breakfast, we found we were really happy with each other. It was a warm, close feeling that we hadn't felt for a few years. We were happy. We went for a long walk together on the moss in the countryside. We listened to the radio. And we found we had a future that we could look forward to, and we started talking about that future. We started talking about what we would do. I had my job, Annie had her teaching, and we looked forward to Jeff coming home. We thought about him and Joyce, hoping that they were going to get married soon when he came home. And Mary was going to graduate from college soon. She was going to come home to start her teaching career, and hopefully she'd get married too. We began to think into a future that would now include grandchildren. Annie went to bed very happy. I stayed down thinking about Jeff. He must be somewhere in Germany now. He must be celebrating the end of the war just like I did all those years ago. And I hope he was celebrating in more than tea like we'd just done. I remembered my armistice and the jubilation I felt. Being able to share something like that with your son is a wonderful thing. And we're both looking forward to his demobbing and to his coming home, along with all the other boys. And that is about it, ladies and gentlemen. More reading of the newspaper, the good news in the newspaper. I hope you've enjoyed my story. When the lights come on again, all over the world, and our boys come home again, all over the world, and the rain or snow is all that may fall from the skies above, and a kiss won't mean goodbye, but hello to love. Goodbye.